Hey, I'm Rachel,
And I'm Amanda, and this is Beyond a Ballot.
powered by DoorDash. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Beyond a Ballot. I'm Rachel here with Amanda. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
All right, we're on the eve of a potential federal election. We're hearing that sources are saying this is going to be called on Sunday with a potential election date of April 28th. And drum roll, please, we have some big news. What's happening?
We do. So many of you have likely tuned in to Rachel's Ontario Votes and BC Votes daily podcast.
Yep.
We're really excited because we are doing this for the federal election. We're going to do a daily 10-minute podcast, a little bite-sized chunk that's going to give you the news of the day. It's going to help you understand where the candidates are at, where the parties are at, and where the polls are at. And we have some very exciting guests with us who are going to join us daily. Who are they?
They are Kathleen Monk, who is going to join us as our NDP voice for the duration of the campaign. And then we are actually handing over the reins of this baby, our podcast, to Hannah Thibodeau. And we are so thrilled that she agreed to sit in the hostess chair for the campaign and let Amanda and I wear our partisan colors through the campaign and talk about our own parties along with Kathleen representing the NDP. So I think it's going to be a really, really fun podcast. You don't have to do anything if you subscribe to this podcast. You just have to wait and listen. If you don't subscribe, make sure that you are subscribed wherever you get your podcast, because then it will come daily to your phone. So you don't have to remember. You can just listen to us every day.
What I love about this is that it's so easy. I mean, it's 10 minutes. It's going to cover, the biggest headlines. It's going to give you what you need to be able to have those dinner table conversations, have conversations with your colleagues, keep you really up to speed, because we know that this election is going to be such a tight race. There's going to be exciting news every day. The polls are going to be polls to watch, and we know how much campaigns matter. So it could go either way. And because of that, we think having a daily voice that kind of brings all of that exciting news in a format that's really easy to digest is what our listeners are hoping for. So we're very excited to bring it to you, and we hope you love it as much as we're going to love making it.
Yes. And both the BC Votes podcast and the Ontario Votes podcast, I got so much feedback that it was really helpful for a lot of people. So this is one of our greatest resources that we can offer you. And hopefully the campaign isn't 97 days long, or we'll be taping a lot of podcasts, but we're anticipating it's going to be a short one, and we hope that you'll join us for the journey. How are you feeling going into this?
I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. Which is a feeling that, I haven't felt in a long time, but I think that Prime Minister Carney is resonating with Canadians, and we're seeing that in the polls. We've seen the Liberals in some polls surpass the Conservatives for the first time in many, many months. So that's what makes this it will be such an exciting race to watch, because we know how tight it's going to be. And again, you'll hear us talk about this a lot. Campaigns really matter. Candidates matter. Nice. Ads matter. Mistakes matter. So the stakes are very, very high especially for Poilievre's Conservatives and Carney's Liberals. So this is one to watch. This may be the most exciting election campaign we've had in a long time.
I know.
How are you feeling?
I mean, I'm also feeling cautiously optimistic. I mean, I was more optimistic a couple of weeks ago, but I'm feeling good. I feel, I have faith in the campaign and the campaign that the Conservatives have historically won. But I also feel this big grandeur around this campaign because of the global situation that we're in. That has just been an astronomical force in this narrative around the entire federal election. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But today, we are so excited to be joined by our guest, J.J. McCullough, and we'll be back to break down all things federal election with him. And now a word from our title sponsor, DoorDash. Just like we go beyond a ballot, DoorDash goes beyond delivery. Last week, we heard from Dasher Christine on how DoorDash enhances her sense of financial security during moments she needs it most. This week, we're digging into the impact dashing has on even more Dashers across the country. For instance, did you know that 93% of Dashers say dashing provides more flexibility than other job opportunities? Or that the top reason people choose to be Dashers is because they can set their own hours? Almost every Dasher, 96%, say that it's important for them to get to choose when to work, and that dashing helps people feel more financially secure because when the unexpected happens, like car repairs or a drop in hours at another job, Dashers can deliver with DoorDash to earn extra income. These insights make it easy to see how DoorDash empowers Canadian businesses, Dashers, and communities alike. Our guest today is someone who I have been such a fan of for many, many years. J.J. McCullough is an incredible Canadian YouTuber who does weekly videos on Canada, Canadian identity, history, politics, and nationalism. He's one of the greatest minds when it comes to facts about Canada and government. And J.J., I am so thrilled to welcome you. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
We're anticipating some kind of election call in the next few days. Who better to talk to than the guy who talks about Canadian elections and Canadian fun facts? And you have such a passion for knowing how things work in Canada and being able to explain it to audiences. Where do you think that came from? Like, how did you get into this?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose like from a young age, I realized that a lot of communication about things relating to Canada and Canadian politics in particular is just not done very well. And that a lot of times there's just kind of like sort of blunt, unglamorous truths that need to, I think, be communicated. And instead there tends to be a lot of, sort of too much kind of like polite fiction and niceties and, sort of self-flattering stereotypes. You know, Canadians, we are a very sort of, I think, as much as we like to think of ourselves as being this very modest people, I do think that we are a people that do sort of hide behind a lot of kind of like patriotic myths and self-aggrandizing sort of things. And sometimes like you just kind of want to hack through the myth and just kind of like, what is actually going on? How do things actually work? You know, what are the sort of the hard truths that people need to learn? Not because there's some sort of value in being sort of told difficult truths as an unto itself, but because you need to just kind of like learn how the world actually is, right? Like Absolutely. It's more useful as a matter of just knowledge and cultural literacy to just have somebody kind of just give you the unvarnished reality. And I just kind of felt like that was something I wasn't getting a lot of. And so, you know, what they say is, you know, you have to try to be the change that you want to see in the world, right? So I've tried in my own modest way to offer a kind of Canadian, I guess, sort of civics education, cultural education kind of thing to my viewers, both to Canadian audiences and also audiences that are in the world who are a big part of my YouTube base.
I love that so much. And I'm curious, before I ask the actual question that I need to ask, you said you got into it at a young age, like kid young, like were you? Because I'm really struggling with getting my kids into discussions around politics, and it's because and I don't know, maybe I need a new way in. But were you kid young, or was this like young adult young?
I was like a teenager. Actually, sort of the genesis of it is I suppose somewhat interesting because like I'm kind of like a cartoonist. Like that's like my first kind of like great passion in life. That's I love drawing cartoons. And then when I was like a teenager, I started kind of getting into political cartoons just because like aesthetically they seemed really cool. Like the visuals of sort of caricature and all that was kind of cool. And then I was like, okay, I need to like learn about politics to kind of understand what these cartoons are all about. And then so I learned about the political side in order to appreciate the cartoons. And then that in turn sort of seduced me into learning more about politics as a sort of new sort of subject of interest in my life. So that was my entry point. Was sort of like as a young teen, I guess I was, 15, 16, 17, sort of in those, when I was in high school. So that was, but I wasn't like one of these hyper precocious kids who was like naming all the members of parliament when they're like 8 years old or anything like that. I think like most young people, I went through a phase where I thought, politics was kind of boring and uninteresting and very like part of the grown-up world. And it was only when I had that entry point of the political cartoons and political satire that I started to become more interested and literate.
Okay, so there's still hope for my kids. I just need to get some
Maybe.
cartoons of Polyev and Carney, and we're off to the races.
Yeah.
And we are actually off to the races, we think, in a few days' time. So my question for you is, what do you think is going to be historically significant about this election?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's historically significant. I think it could be historically significant on a number of fronts. I mean, one of them is just that it has been taken for granted for, several years now that the Conservatives had this in the bag, right?
Yeah.
Like that the Conservatives were going to win and possibly win. I remember when this was being talked about, possibly win the biggest landslide in Canadian history, right? And so the degree to which they do not achieve that, and I think sort of the safe money, regardless of what the outcome is, I think the safe money is on that they will not achieve the largest landslide in Canadian history at this point.
Right.
And so the history will then be kind of like what went wrong for the Conservatives in that sense, right? And we can talk about like what degree of wronggoing we will actually experience, but clearly something has changed fundamentally in just the nature of the political conversation and sort of the partisan climate. And I think that's something that's likely to be discussed for a long time to come. Did it have something to do with the stepping down of Justin Trudeau? And then in that sense, does that reflect something about just how unpopular Justin Trudeau was as a kind of signature figure in Canadian political history? Or does it have something to do with the worsening of Canada-US relations and sort of Trump and the way that he's kind of made us think differently about various things relating to politics? Or, does it have something to do with Pierre Poilievre himself and the way that he has chosen to run a campaign and the degree that he's been sort of like, caught flat-footed by, say, Prime Minister Carney's decision to repeal the carbon tax, which it seems like he had all of the eggs in his basket of. So this is going to be just a very interesting analysis of how a front runner can go from such sort of indisputable front runner status to something less than that. And, the final chapter of this story is obviously sort of yet to be written. We don't know if he's just going to straight up lose or if he's going to win something kind of like middling. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be a case study of how you can go from how conventional wisdom can basically just dramatically change in a relatively short period of time.
So you did a video, I think it was last week, on Mark Carney. And going into this election, what are your thoughts on the players that we're seeing? I mean, obviously, everyone's talking about Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, but we also have Blanchette that's running the Bloc, and Elizabeth May, who's back for another run as the Green leader. Talk to us about some of the players.
Rachel, you forgot Jagmeet Singh.
Oh, and Jagmeet Singh. Oh, my favorite. Vote for Jagmeet Singh. Sorry about that. And Canadians should not forget about Jagmeet Singh. And so talk to us about some of the players as we go into this election.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because it does feel like this is in some ways a very uniquely two-man race. Sometimes you have Canadian elections that seem like they're defined by multiple sort of party leaders kind of all bouncing around each other. Like I remember sort of in the 2000s, right? Like you remember Gilles Duceppe was like this very sort of substantial character. And of course, Jack Layton was a very sort of substantial character as well. But it feels like in this election, what you're seeing the Liberals and the Conservatives led by two sort of dynamic, interesting people that I think a lot of Canadians are sort of intrigued by. And then you have all of the other parties who are just led by these kind of like, sort of, I'm sorry to say, kind of like worn out figures that have just been around for so long that we're all kind of sick of them, right? Like this is Elizabeth May has been head of the Green Party in some form or another for like 20 years.
Yeah.
It's like, I think we get what Elizabeth May has to offer. And it's like, at some point it's, take a hint, Elizabeth, but it's, Jagmeet Singh is the same way, right? This is going to be his third election. He has not been successful. There's not really any reason for the NDP to be optimistic about their chances when they've put this product forward. And that's what, you guys know. Politics is marketing. It's like a game of you put a product forward. Does the consumer, in this case, the electorate, do they want that? Yes or no? And the NDP, I'm sorry to say, it just seems to me they have a strategy that is just kind of based on this idea that, things are just somehow going to change if you just keep trying it hard enough, hard enough, hard enough. And the NDP has a long tradition of doing this. They do, in contrast to the Liberals and the Conservatives, where you tend to get one shot and then you're out on the street. The NDP does tend to run the same candidate again and again, whether that's Leighton or the woman before Leighton, Alexa McDonough, who's sort of long forgotten now, or Mulcair, or Jagmeet or himself, right? Or Edward Broadbent before any of them, right? There's something just different about the NDP culture where I think they've just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that they're always going to lose. So even running a proven loser somehow, doesn't upset them as much or isn't seen as a strategically bad decision in quite the same way. But the point is that I think that because you're seeing these people like Jagmeet Singh, like Elizabeth May, who I think the public is just clearly kind of tired of, I think there's going to be a lot more focus on the two-man race between these two, relatively new and, like I said, kind of fresh and interesting and certainly like quite polarizing figures.
Does Jagmeet get another shot after this?
I mean, I think it's going to be pretty hard to justify that, right? I mean, but it depends, right? Because like I said before, like the NDP standards of success are so incredibly low. So if he just if he can create some sort of narrative that he did better than expected in some modest way, maybe he can still hang on. If you get into a situation where there's a Liberal minority government, then he can maybe hang on because it's like, well, because the NDP has this whole sort of narrative that this is in some ways that's an NDP victory, like a Liberal minority government, because in their mind that sort of maximizes their leverage over over the agenda of the government. So I think if that happens, but if there's like a Conservative majority, I think it's very difficult to imagine how Jagmeet could justify hanging on.
Okay, so Canada's elections are often described as boring. I don't know. I don't feel like there's anything boring about what's been happening the last few weeks.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
We keep calling it like the Olympics of politics or like the Super Bowl of politics, but boring compared to the US is how it's been described. Do you think that's fair? Or do you think that we're just bad at retelling our own political stories?
I mean, I don't know. It's like, what is boring? I mean, it's just obviously it's happening at a different scale. There's sort of different things at stake. I think you kind of have to judge it not based on, not based on sort of like a US sort of Canadian comparison, but it's like, is this interesting by the standards of Canada? And I think that, this election certainly is. I think plenty of elections are interesting by the standards of Canada. If you sort of think about the kind of issues that matter to you, sort of the debates about the future of the country and what sort of government we want, I think there's plenty of reason to be interested in it. The fact is some people just might not be that interested in politics that is sort of closer to their own lives. And, there's not much you can sort of say about that. But I certainly think that Pierre is an interesting character. I think Mark Carney is an interesting character. I think that, this story that I was just kind of saying, like the idea that the Conservatives were riding so high and may now be on the brink of losing. I mean, that's interesting to me. That's not a boring thing to watch. I'm going to be on the edge of my seat seeing how all this sort of plays out. And then as a result, like what kind of country Canada is and what the voters of Canada are like. To me, it's never boring to kind of like learn sort of like what are the passions and interests of your fellow man and woman in the street, right?
I have a quick follow-up. Sorry, Rachel.
Yeah, it's okay.
Because we were just talking about Jagmeet Singh and whether or not he gets another shot. And you were saying, I think that Poilievre's an interesting character and Carney's an interesting character. And I do not disagree. And that we're in this, kind of this frame of these monumental shifts. So my question is, does Poilievre get another shot if he loses this election?
I can't see how he would. I mean, I'm kind of more in conservative world, and maybe some of your listeners can kind of sense a sort of bias in that direction in some of the answers I've been giving.
That's okay.
But I mean, but based on my sort of perceptions of conservative world and the conversations I've been having with other sort of conservative pundits and journalists and base types and staffers and all that, I definitely have a sense that like people are kind of a little bit more on the edge with Poilievre these days. Like that there was kind of a sense where he was given a lot of benefit of the doubt. He seemed to be doing everything right for a while. But, politics can be pretty cruel to people that don't deliver the goods. And if he manages to lose this one, I think that, you can easily imagine the knives coming out for him in relatively short order, especially considering that, like I said before, in the two big parties, in the Liberals and the Conservatives, there tends to be a lot sort of less tolerance for people that can't close the deal, especially when they came so close, right? Like Aaron O'Toole, the old Conservative leader,
Yeah.
was seen as coming very close to winning, and he, got shanked in very short order afterwards,
Totally.
right? And I think that, the thing too is that, like, Pierre's base are much more of like the real sort of true believing conservative types. And so as a
Yeah.
result, I think that those type of people are just less conciliatory in general. It does make me worry a little bit, though, of who would come after Pierre, because I do
Yeah.
think that you would get I think there's very high chance that you get a much more kind of like radical right wing sort of
You
conspiratorial
do?
sort of minded. I do think so. Yeah,
You
I think
think
there's a
so?
real danger of that. I think like a Leslyn Lewis type, I think would be sort of the
What?
next in the line.
I could see
That's
that.
No,
my
Yeah.
I
yeah.
cannot believe that. No, because how would they win a general election? How would
Because
Well, it
they?
wouldn't matter who can win a general election, right? It would be like because the conservative base would be the ones making that decision, right? And so when you're a real sort of, I don't know, like when you're a real sort of ideologue, you tend to perceive the problem with the candidate as not being ideological enough, right? So if
Right.
you have like Aaron O'Toole, who was seen as being very moderate, we get rid of him, we get somebody who's more right wing than him, Pierre Poilievre, and if Pierre can't win, I think that there'll be a narrative that he wasn't conservative enough, that he wasn't fighting a true conservative campaign. And you're already sort of seeing people frame this, sort of say that he went in too hard on the carbon tax at the expense of things like immigration and stuff like that. And so I definitely think that there's a world in which you can get to picking a more radical leader, and then that I think will probably be bad for the Conservative Party. But you kind of have to get into the mind of a sort of like really irritated kind of right-wing base of the party and how they would perceive a loss versus how perhaps other people might perceive it.
Can
Fascinating.
Pierre turn this ship around right now? I mean, we saw this week all these polls come out that say that the Liberals are in majority territory going into this potential campaign. Can Pierre turn it around? And what does that mean in terms of framing Mark Carney? Like, who is Mark Carney? What does Carney need to do to really get Canadians to buy his message?
What Mark Carney would have to do to buy his message. I mean, Mark Carney in some ways I think is kind of sitting a little pretty. Like it seems like, he's just the fact, because the thing is, at the end of the day, it does seem like most Canadians have a preference for the Liberal Party as their default party. I said in one of my recent videos that you have to go all the way back 40 years, 1984 was the first time that a Liberal prime minister did not win at least one term, So it's like every Liberal prime minister tends to be given the benefit of the doubt, and people are willing to give them a try. And so in that sense, and this is why they sometimes use this kind of cliched phrase, the natural governing party of Canada, right? The Liberals are in power unless someone can make a very compelling case against them, which often has to do with like the Conservative leader is sort of like uniquely interesting, the state of the country is such, and the Liberals have maybe been in power for such a long period of time, and so on and so forth. So I think like Pierre's sort of strategy is just kind of based on running that type of campaign, saying like this gang has been in charge for too long, we're sick of them, the bad sort of nature of the economy, and we know that sort of Canadians are pretty upset with the status of the economy right now. It's just kind of like linking all of that to Carney. But what makes Carney a distinct figure is that, of course, he was not part of Trudeau's administration, right? He has been an outsider in the same way that Pierre is an outsider. So you do kind of have an unusual sort of state of affairs, because normally the head of the Liberal Party, and certainly normally the prime minister of the Liberal Party, is somebody who had been in the administration of the previous government, who had been a cabinet minister, who had been there at the table. And so Pierre's life is a lot more challenging now, because he's going to have to try to tie Carney to Trudeau in a way that I don't think is a very sort of like natural connection. And thus, there becomes a lot more sort of pressure on Pierre to have a kind of plan B, right? Because it's pretty clear that Pierre wanted to run a campaign against Trudeau era policies that Trudeau was going to be prepared to defend, like, say, the carbon tax. But then when you get rid of Trudeau and you get rid of the carbon tax, it's like, well, what do you have now? And so I do think, like I said, there's going to be a lot of pressure for Pierre, ideally, to have a backup plan, to maybe run on things like a middle-class tax cut or cuts to immigration or some of these other kinds of things that are sort of bubbling up as issues of concern to the broad Canadian public. There's a sort of hope, and I think this is kind of perhaps maybe the wrong strategy. There's kind of a hope that Mark Carney, as he introduces himself to the nation, that a lot of people are just going to be turned off by him like that his sort of, elitist background, he's this Ivy League educated sort of snob, globalist banker type, like that's going to be powerfully off-putting to people. I think that's very off-putting to a certain type of conservative voter, but I'm not super convinced that it's necessarily going to be the most off-putting thing in the world to your average sort of person, especially when we're kind of in a political context in which I think populism and this kind of like sort of pure kind of like demagogic approach to politics, as opposed to like a professionalized, credentialed approach to politics. I think the populist approach is kind of falling out of favor, obviously, because of Donald Trump's government and what the pure populist approach to government looks like in practice. So I do think that there might be an underrated appetite to have this kind of professional, technocratic, serious, bureaucrat basically running the country for the next however many years.
Yeah, I was saying this week, echoing, I think, what a lot of people are feeling as well, this idea that the conservative comm strategy worked too well. It's like, for 2 years, they told the country that it was broken. And the reason why it was broken was because of Justin Trudeau and because of the carbon tax. They did such a good job that they got rid of Justin Trudeau and the carbon tax, but they did it too soon, right? They did it before they went to the polls. I do have the sense, and, obviously I'm a liberal, so, I'll preface it with that, but I do have the sense that there isn't an obvious plan B. Because I've said where I've given the Conservative Party credit time and time again, and Rachael can vouch for this, is their excellent communications. But where are they right now? Like, where is the pivot? Where is the recalibration? What is the plan B? Do you really think they were caught so much on their back foot on this one?
I mean, it seems like they were. I mean, I remember years ago when Pierre was first sort of installed as leader, I was like asked, what are one of his, like, what is a flaw to sort of be on the lookout for? And I definitely felt like his sort of stubbornness, his self-confidence, his kind of sense like, I know how to close this deal. I know what works. I know what the Canadian people want to hear. And so it becomes very difficult, I think, for someone with that temperament to make a kind of pivot. And I think the carbon tax is really the example of this. Like, I think that there was like growing, I think it was pretty evident that as pissed off as people might have been about the carbon tax at one time, that was kind of starting to decline as a high salience issue, even in the minds of the conservative base. And yet the messaging from the conservatives continues to be carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax Carney, carbon tax Chrystia Freeland, carbon tax everything. And now, even as Carney has repealed the carbon tax, they're still doubling down on this messaging where it's like, well, we can't really trust him, and like read the fine print, and he secretly wants to bring it back, and this kind of thing. And that is, to me, that is troubling, because not only is that not resonating with, I think, the broad sort of electorate, it's not even resonating with the conservative base anymore, who are tired of that message, and they want to see stuff like I said, like tax cuts, something to do with immigration. I think that stuff obviously to do with the trade war with the US. People want to see a sort of a distinct conservative approach to that, as opposed to just a Me Too approach to that. So, but the thing is, the concern is just that Pierre Poilievre just isn't interested in those issues the way that he's interested in Trudeau and interested in the carbon tax. And so the danger is that he fights this campaign against a sort of shadow enemy, the ghost of Trudeau, the ghost of the carbon tax. So
I like that.
That's
I like that analysis. That's so interesting.
Okay, let's pick your brain on the actual process here, because everyone's reporting that this election could be called on Sunday. So for our listeners that are tuning in maybe for the first time and they're thinking, okay, this election's going to start, like, what does that even mean? Can you break down how we go into an election on Sunday?
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously one of the more controversial aspects of the Canadian political system, and it's a very sort of distinct aspect, which is that the timing of elections is the prerogative of the Prime Minister, right? So it's like the Prime Minister gets. I mean, in theory we have a fixed election by statute. The election is supposed to be in October. But that law is arguably unconstitutional because the Prime Minister can choose to have elections whenever he wants. And so our fixed election dates are only, sometimes respected. But very often the Prime Minister, decides that it would be more politically convenient for him to have an election earlier than later.
Right.
And as we've discussed, the Liberal Party is doing well in the polls right now. And so Prime Minister Carney seems like he's just going to pull the plug and have an early election in order to maximize his partisan advantage. And again, like, this is a very controversial thing. And I think if we were designing a political system from scratch, tomorrow, we wouldn't give the prime minister that kind of power to sort of, cynically take advantage of something that is supposed to be a kind of like neutral moment of public adjudication of the government in such a way. But that is the system that we have, and so we have to go along with it. So yeah, Carney will what they call he'll meet with the governor general, and there's all this sort of like ceremony about it. And formally the parliament is dissolved, which means that basically everybody who's an MP kind of loses their seat and then has to run for re-election for another seat. And of course, through the outcome of a nationwide parliamentary election, we sort of see what the makeup of the parliament is, and then thus who gets to be the prime minister of the new government, right? So yeah, and then the campaign is also, once again, at the jurisdiction of the of the prime minister. So people I've seen in the press, they say it could be, 50 days or 40 something days or 35 days or whatever. So like, it's usually like somewhere in the realm of 2 months, but Carney will be able to set exactly how long that campaign will be. And then during that campaign time, a lot of laws kick in. Again, this is also controversial, right? Like that there's certain forms of political expression that you can and cannot do during election time. And, there's laws about the signage, and, even different cities have different laws about this kind of thing. But, basically what Canadians will see is that the second the election is called, you'll see, election signs everywhere and ads on television. And, because then the parties are allowed to sort of spend money in particular ways that they couldn't in other times and all of this. And
what is the writ, and is it dropped? That seems to be the big question.
Yeah, this is like weird, like Canadian. I honestly, like, of all my great knowledge of Canadian things, I don't actually even really know where that comes from. Right? It's some sort of. It's do you guys know? I don't know. It's some.
I used to know it. It's something about like the paper that they sign is called the writ, something like that.
I feel caught off guard here. No, I'm not sure.
There's a lot of controversy over whether or not the writ is dropped or the writ is like what's the other thing they say?
Hey guys, I want you to know, because I Googled it real time.
Oh, okay.
A writ is a form of written command in the name of a court or other legal authority to act.
Okay,
so
yeah.
You're right, Rachel.
Yeah.
It's the actual written
paper,
declaration.
Okay. Yes.
We're going to the polls.
in sort of like casual jargon that you read in the newspaper, the writ drop just refers to like the calling of the election, right? Like we're dropping the writ.
But there's all this controversy about whether or not it's dropped or it's signed.
It's signed.
Signed.
It's actually funny. Like there's a thing called like, the Canadian Gazette, which is like this like kind of government newspaper.
Yes.
And it's interesting, like because technically speaking, everything the government does kind of has to be like published in the Canadian Gazette.
Right.
And it's very funny when you read some of these things that, we don't really sort of think about. Like we just think, oh, the prime minister called the election. We just go on television and said, I call an election, right? But it's like you read the Canadian Gazette and it's always like in this very like formal language where it's like, oh, His Majesty on behalf of the excellent Governor General has hereby proclaimed that such will happen, and that kind of thing. So it's like when we talk about the writ being dropped and these kinds of things, it's the sort of like the more sort of ceremonial kind of manifestation of
absolutely
of what we just otherwise think of as just sort of routine political happenings.
What do you think is the biggest myth Canadians have about our elections?
The biggest myth that Canadians have about our elections. So that's an interesting question. I think that Canadians probably. I think that there are a lot more rules regarding how you can express yourself during a Canadian election than probably a lot of people realize. Canada has very strict campaign finance laws that limit how much money you can give to political parties, how much money you can spend on sort of political advertising and stuff. I think that a lot of Canadians probably think that our elections are much more of a free-for-all in terms of spending and advertising than they actually are.
Yep.
But I think that if we had less strict laws, you'd actually see a lot more advertising than you currently do. And, the campaigns would be much bigger, much flashier. They'd spend a lot more money. So, there's often a kind of sort of cynicism that you see in political advertising and political memes and stuff online, which is the idea that our elections are kind of like very corrupted by the influence of money and this sort of thing. And my contrarian hot take is I actually think that there probably should be more money in Canadian elections than there
Me
currently
too.
is. I think that spending is too restricted. I think that free expression is too restricted during election time. And I would like to see these sorts of things be a little bit more sort of loosened up. But the fact is because the public, I think, in my opinion, is sort of suffering under a kind of delusion that our elections are like very corrupt and like very corrupted by money, that it becomes very easy for the governments to pass stricter and stricter campaign finance laws that are kind of like fighting a problem that doesn't really exist. But the public perceives it to exist, so there's no sort of political disadvantage to continuing to sort of restrict sort of free expression in terms of advertising and political donations and stuff like that.
For sure.
I have one question for you, and then we want to throw some trivia at you.
Wait,
Okay.
I have another one after that.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Amanda's like, I got to talk to this guy forever.
Wait, I have more. We have more time, right? I love
Yeah.
this conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question, because I always like to nerd out with you. That's my favorite thing to
Yes.
do because you care about these things as much as I do. When you think about federal elections, the history of the country, which election really stands out for you as either interesting or shocking or a turning point in Canadian history? Is there one that you think about more than others?
Yeah, there's probably two, which are actually sort of like the two free trade elections, which I think were very interesting. So, like, there was an election in 1911, and there was an election in 1988, and in both cases, the sort of front of ballot question was the issue of sort of like free trade with the U.S., right? And of course, this is an issue that feels very distinctly relevant right now, but. In 1911, the issue was sort of the prime minister was Wilfrid Laurier, and the question was, should we have free trade with the William Howard Taft administration in the U.S. And the conservatives of the time were the more anti-American party, and so they demagogued very hard that free trade with America was going to be the harbinger of annexation by America, and that old man Taft was, had his licking his chubby lips and just couldn't wait to gobble us up and this kind of thing. And then, Wilfrid Laurier, was sort of portrayed as being kind of like unpatriotic and kind of willing to roll out the welcome mat for old man Taft, right? And then you saw, and then ultimately that sort of anti-American kind of fear-mongering worked very well for the Conservatives, and Prime Minister Robert Borden got in, and he was in charge for a while and ran a successful administration, but was ultimately elected to power on a very sort of anti-American platform. And then the same thing happened in 1988 when you had Prime Minister Brian Mulroney,
Right.
who at the time, this was actually, it's interesting how political sort of ideology can kind of flip over time,
Yep.
right? Like, even when Brian Mulroney became head of the Conservative Party, he had to sort of say, well, the Conservative Party since the time of Robert Borden has been committed to no free trade with America, and I'm proudly committed to that conservative tradition. But Brian Mulroney flip-flopped on that and actually did pursue free trade with the Ronald Reagan administration. And then as a result, it was the Liberal Party that ran, in my opinion, a very anti-American campaign in 1988, saying that, Mulroney was rolling out the welcome mat for Reagan, and Reagan's going to annex Canada and take away all of our distinct Canadian identities and stuff. But Mulroney won, and we do have free trade, at least for now. And so, like, those were just two very interesting campaigns to me, because they were both about an issue. Like, the election was clearly like a de facto referendum on a policy in a way that you just don't see now. And also just that we went in two completely different directions. And so it's very interesting to imagine how Canadian history would have been different if we had had free trade with the U.S. much earlier than we did. And it's also interesting to also imagine, what if the election of 1988 had gone the other way? What if we never had free trade with the U.S.? Would we be in a better place, a worse place? It's sort of just these great sort of like what ifs. And of course, I'm just always very interested in Canada-US relations as well. And it's just kind of interesting because one thing, actually, I think something that a lot of Americans have been saying lately, and they say it from a kind of like good place, is they're saying like, Trump has like so offended the Canadians that look at how mean they are, and they're booing the national anthem and this kind of thing. Our great allies, the Canadians, have turned against us. And it's like, that's true to a point, but you can look back to, like I said, like 1911, like this kind of anti-American stuff has always had a lot of political traction in Canada. And And I think it's important that we not be too sort of sanguine about this.
And not forget, we burned down the White House.
Yeah, of course.
How could we forget?
How could we forget?
I have one last question and then we'll go to trivia, promise.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing that we're often asked about is the idea of the popular vote. And people have a hard time understanding what that means. Can you just really quickly break that one down for us? Because as we head into an election, I think it's important for people to understand what that means at the end.
Yeah, I mean, technically speaking, the popular vote doesn't mean anything, right? Like it doesn't, technically speaking, doesn't mean anything in the US. In fact, I don't think there's that many countries where the popular vote is, the deciding factor. But the
No.
popular vote is basically just if you add up all of the votes that are cast across the country for one party or another, sort of what does it add up to? And this is kind of an interesting stat because it gives you a clear window into what party is more popular in kind of the aggregate. But of
Right.
course, our elections are not decided in that kind of way. Our elections are decided in hundreds of individual votes that are happening in different communities. And then each individual community, votes for their MP. And then the party that gets the most MPs, gets the prime ministership, right? And so as a result, just because of the way that, MPs are not elected with a majority of the popular vote in the individual sort of jurisdictions, they're elected with what they call the first past the post, or, the plurality system. So whoever gets more votes than somebody else, even if that's only like 35%, you still get to be elected member of parliament. And then so when you add up all of those individual riding results, they can often result in somebody winning the most seats, but not winning the most votes in aggregate. And that can strike a lot of people as being sort of fundamentally unjust or undemocratic. Right. We know that the Trudeau Liberals in the last two elections, they lost the popular vote.
Right.
The Conservatives won more of the popular vote. It's important to acknowledge, though, that the Conservatives didn't win a majority of the popular vote. They just won more than the Liberals did. Mm-hmm. And so if we just kind of believe that there is, because I suppose it is weird on some level that a party that most Canadians do not want to be in power can win. I'm just looking at the numbers now, right? So it's like in the last election, the Conservatives won 33.7% of the popular vote, and the Liberals won 32.6% of the popular vote, right? So it's clear that more people wanted the Conservatives to win than the Liberals, but that's ultimately not how we sort of decide these sorts of things. Although some people would also argue that, would be equally sort of unjust on some level if 33%, which still means that a large majority of people didn't want the Conservatives either. But this is the Canadian political system. I'm not to mince words. It's got a lot of problems with it. Like I said before, if we had to invent a political system from scratch tomorrow, I think there's a lot of things we would do differently. But my conservative instincts is just that this is the system that we've sort of inherited, and it has a certain neutrality to it, and it has rules that we know any sort of party can win under if you just kind of like learn how to play by those rules. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that those rules are objectively the best that we could ever possibly imagine.
Well, Justin Trudeau came in saying he was going to change all of it, and he didn't. Yeah. So maybe Mark Carney will do the same. Okay, let's jump into some trivia here. And I always get asked trivia like this.
Trivia is hard, by the way.
I never know the answer.
I know. I'm not clearly. I didn't know that writ thing, so
don't feel bad.
Okay.
I don't know what's happening. Okay, go.
You might know some of these, though. Okay. Which Canadian federal election had the longest voting period in history?
Oh, that was, I think, the 2015 one, right?
That's what I would have answered, too. But in fact, it was in 1867. It was from August 7th to September 20th, over 6 weeks. But 2015 is what I would have answered, too, because that was astronomically long that Prime Minister Harper called in that election.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's an interesting point, because in the very early elections in Canada in like the 19th century, they didn't have one voting day. I mean, like today you can vote early.
Right.
And so in theory, there's like lots of voting days. But like even when you like look at the historical record and it's like, well, when did the 1867 election or the 18 whatever election take place? They will list it as having occurred over the course of many, many days. So in that sense,
really
it was fair. Like a weirdly... Yeah.
Okay.
It was-
Okay.
Kind of a trick question. Fine.
All right. Let's try this one. Who was the only Canadian prime minister to win the largest majority in history?
The largest majority in history, that was, I think, Mulrooney in 84.
You're right. Ding, ding, ding,
Yeah.
ding. 211 out of 282 seats. That's quite the majority.
It was
Okay.
a huge landslide. Yeah.
You're doing well here. What's the
Thank
shortest
you.
time a Canadian prime minister has served due to an election loss?
Due to an election loss?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Just like they came
Oh.
in as prime minister and then they lost the election. So
Yeah.
many people are thinking that it was Kim Campbell.
No, but I think it was Sir Charles Tupper,
You're
right?
right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That. Okay. Next one. Which federal election had the highest voter turnout ever recorded in Canadian history?
Oh, geez, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I would think that this would maybe be like one of the World War One or World War Two ones. Is it?
Close.
Yeah. What was it?
1958, when
Oh,
almost
really?
80% of eligible voters cast a ballot, giving John Diefenbaker a massive victory.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. 1958, eh? That's
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
post war.
that was a big.
It's
Yeah, that was
post-war.
post-war.
Yeah.
But I would have, because it's interesting, right? Because you figure that when the turnout is very high, it would be in a context where the stakes of the election seem very high. And I think that if you
Yes.
told your average Canadian, 1958, huge turnout, it would be like, well, what was going on in
Why?
1958 that was so
Exactly.
important, right?
What happened then?
Yeah. What happened then?
Okay. We have our last question. Has Canada ever had a federal election on Christmas Day?
On Christmas Day?
Yes.
I don't think so. I mean, maybe one of the early 19th century elections overlapped with Christmas.
Yep. 1917 federal election was held on December 17th. Just days. Oh, sorry. It was right around
Days before
Christmas Day.
Christmas.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
You're right.
You're right.
You were right.
And
We
it,
tried to trick you.
it was during World War One.
Okay.
It was
Yeah,
also the
that-
first election, interestingly, where women were allowed to vote. Nurses and
Mhm.
women that were related to soldiers who were at war. Who knew?
Yeah, that was a pretty famously corrupt election actually in 1917. That was the conservative government that I mentioned, Robert Borden, who had beat
Yeah.
Wilfrid Laurier in the free trade thing. And Borden, during the war, he proclaimed his government a government of national unity. And there was all these kind of like sort of sneaky things that he did to sort of stay in power in order, even though we see this as very progressive, giving women the right to vote, but this at the time it was sort of seen as a way that he could sort of like shore up his own power by getting sort of
interesting.
women who were sort of sympathetic to his government to do that. I think it was they were also giving the vote to soldiers overseas in order to sort of back up the incumbent party and this kind of thing. So it was there's always another side to a lot of these
You
these
are
fun facts.
so brilliant. Oh my gosh.
Oh wow.
You're brilliant. You're also a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I think you would be a great dinner party guest.
Yes.
So,
Will you come back for our
putting it
dinner
out there.
party?
Of course,
I meant an
no.
actual dinner party, but yes, one of ours. We've kept you longer than we said we would, so we want to thank you for joining us today. It was so much fun. I know our listeners are going to love that. Remember, if an election is called this weekend, we'll be launching our daily 10-minute election breakdown podcast with the amazing Kathleen Monk and Hannah Thibodeau as soon as the writ is dropped. So make sure you're subscribed. Now you know what that means if the writ is dropped. Make sure you're subscribed to this podcast so you get it daily. We will speak to you soon. Thanks for being here, JJ.
No problem. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening. New episodes air every Friday.
Subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram and find us at beyondaballot.com.